Absolutely.
And then yeah, if everybody else would mute yourself, I guess we're ready to go.
Okay, and definitely feel free to unmute, ask questions, raise hands. Scream at me. I'll be happy to answer questions in the middle. And also this talk that I'm going to give today was originally given at the National Wildlife Society meeting last October or September. Not sure when it was now. And it was a virtual meeting. They wanted it all recorded. So it's a little bit different, maybe a little less dynamic than I try to make my talks because it's more of a script, but I had to take all of the timings and animation out. So we'll just kind of wing it today. And if anybody gets lost, definitely stop me. And the study that I'm going to talk about tonight was generated by our overall project with all of our collaborators. That's one of the largest and longest running waterfowl telemetry efforts that's really ever been undertaken anywhere in the globe. It's involved tons of different people that I'd like to recognize at the outset. In addition to those folks that you see their logos on the screen, we really owe a pretty big debt of gratitude to the California Waterfowl Association, and for this project in particular, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife staff at Summer Lake and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Water Resources, who provided both boots on the ground and funding and logistical support. In total, these groups and us have developed a data set that's marked over 1,300 individuals from 14 different species of waterfowl, all in the Pacific Flyway. And since 2005, we've generated over 10 million individual locations on birds spanning the entire year. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about observations that we saw the fall of 2020 on that particular subspecies of greater white-fronted goose called the Thule Goose. That's a species of special concern in California. And like I said, this was a pretty collaborative effort. I just want to make sure everybody gets recognized. So I think by now we all pretty much accept the premise that by most measures, the impact of wildfire on the landscape and to the people and wildlife within them are increasing. The extent, severity of wildfires has increased, and the timing of wildfire has shifted in responses to changes in precipitation or temperature patterns. As biologists, we have a long history of looking at the direct impacts of wildfire, how they affect wildlife, by asking questions like, what happens to individuals when their habitat burns, or what happens to populations when some individuals can't escape fire? We've also developed an increasing awareness of how wildfire indirectly shapes landscapes and habitats. Examples would be how landscape dynamics change by resetting succession and going back to kind of shrub, returning forest to shrublands, or facilitating spread of flammable invasive grasses like cheatgrass or red brome. We also know a lot about how fires change things like nutrient cycling and the base of a lot of the food webs that make some nutrients more available or less available. In short, there's been a lot of research into these sorts of direct effects of fire. The work I'm going to describe today looks a little more obliquely at how fire can affect species by extending these sorts of looks into things into kind of a second order impact of wildfire. That is, what sort of effects can the smoke plume generated by wildfire have? We expect that these sort of effects would be relatively transient Rather than removing habitat entirely, smoke is a temporary feature. But winds can carry smoke long distances and result in impacts that may range far from the fire perimeter itself. Due to our ongoing research with waterfowl and the Pacific Flyway, in 2020, we were uniquely positioned to observe impacts from the most extreme fire season in the Western US that we've had on record. This enabled us to see in real time how migrating waterfowl responded to never before seen conditions. In general, waterfowl migration towards California starts in earnest as early as mid-August or early September, which in 2020 coincided with truly record-breaking wildfire conditions. Many fires had already been burning for months before the first goose or duck headed south. But dry and windy conditions during the first 2 weeks of September resulted in a virtual explosion of fire activity. During the first week of September, California set a new state record with 2 million acres of land burned in that year. By September 15th, that figure ballooned to 3.2 million acres. In total, over 5 million acres burned in the West in 2020. Sorry, that says 2,000 fire perimeters. That should be 2020 fire perimeters. 2020 was also a year that we got a new tool to assess and predict wildfire smoke concentrations. The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration maintains a weather modeling system called the High Resolution Rapid Refresh, or HRRR model, that includes a new component which produces a three-dimensional prediction of smoke concentrations. This new capacity became operational in December of 2020, but we were able to use the pre-deployment experimental model to track how migrating birds interacted with smoke. The HRRR uses visible and infrared satellite images to identify smoke and predicts concentrations and spread based on other factors in the model, such as wind speed and direction. This allows the HRR smoke to calculate injection height, or how high the smoke gets, and smoke plume trajectory. The model is initialized twice per day when the satellites pass overhead and produce hourly predictions up to 36 hours in the future to enable better response to fires. Switching gears back to the birds for a moment, one of the species we've tracked since 2018 is the Thule Goose. Thule Goose is the largest, darkest, and rarest subspecies of greater white-fronted goose, which spans the northern hemisphere. The breeding population of Thule Goose is just a few thousand individuals located in south central Alaska, near Anchorage, basically. It's categorized in California as a species of special concern, which means it's part of a special harvest regulation for dark geese in portions of California to reduce harvest. We obtained location data from birds using either 38 or 45 gram solar recharging GPS neck collars produced by a Lithuanian company called Ornitella, which recorded locations every 15 minutes and collected other information such as accelerometry or magnetometry, light levels, voltage, whole bunch of things to tell us what the bird is doing and how well the transmitter is performing. Each of the birds were rocket netted at Summer Lake National Wildlife Area for capture and marked and released on site. The wintering population of Thule Goose is located in the western Sacramento Valley of California. Spring migration routes are oceanic, but typically occur near the coast. Breeding range for Thule Goose is limited to the Upper Cook Inlet in Alaska. Individuals often make a molting site migration to the northeastern Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, but will return to Cook's Inlet and Puget Sound not Puget Sound, Howe Sound? I forget the name of the sound up there. Sorry, it's not Puget. To set the stage, to stage prior to migration. Fall migration is also typically undertaken a few miles off the coast, with birds passing through Hecate Strait, often passing over the north edge of Vancouver Island on a direct path to Summer Lake Wildlife Area. Both resighting of neck-collared birds and radio telemetry indicate that the vast majority of birds will stage at Summer Lake prior to entering California. Migration flights often undulate, reaching altitudes of 1,000 to 1,500 meters or 4,000 to 5,000 feet maybe. During migration, birds will often stop for short durations at coastal sites or raft upon the ocean for short periods. This usually lasts for just a few hours, though terrestrial stops at coastal lakes, lagoons, and mudflats will sometimes last for multiple days. Thule geese are among the first migrating waterfowl to travel the Pacific Flyway from Alaska and will head south as early as late August or early September, which in 2020 was a rough patch. You can see the bird rafting on the ocean and floating in the currents here in this inset image. Sorry, started again. Just prior to Thule Goose arrival in the region, a low pressure system in the North Pacific drew smoke westward, drawing a smoke plume nearly 2/3 of the way to Hawaii. By the time the geese arrived, this started to reverse direction and set the stage for conditions awaiting birds arriving in September of 2020. Which was basically a wall of smoke that transected the continent and left birds with few options but to deal with dense smoke. The way we set up our investigation was to start with the assumption that Thule geese really only want to go from point A to point B. That is to go from South Central Alaska to Summer Lake Wildlife Area. Given that, and upon encountering smoke, each bird really only has 4 options. They can try and go around the smoke, they could fly over the smoke, they could stop and wait the smoke out, or they could ignore it altogether and just continue as though it doesn't exist. At the time, in September of 2020, we only had the prior year's information for comparison, which included 5 individuals that had made a fall migration in 2019. Though last year we had 2 additional birds that returned from Alaska that had similar routes and timing as well, all 7 of which are displayed here in this graphic. Conditions in the Pacific Northwest were relatively smoke-free in 2019 and 2021, and reflect, generally favorable migratory conditions. These next few images will show the densest smoke concentrations as they develop and change during the days where we observe birds within the region. The bird's destination at Summer Lake is identified by the black star. You'll see a few-hour track for individuals with each map, starting as they come over the top of Vancouver Island. The first birds encountered smoke over the ocean on the morning of September 11th. One individual that had overnighted in the water off Vancouver Island flew along the leading band of smoke towards Portland, while 2 birds arriving in the infected area started to raft offshore. Upon encountering the dense smoke in southern Washington, the leading bird backtracked to Olympia and flew around Mount St. Helens. This recursive movement was a feature that only occurred in 2020, and along the southern leg of migration south of Vancouver Island, once the birds encountered smoke. This chart shows how focused birds were in their trajectory towards Summer Lake. These tall peaks mean direct flights towards Summer Lake, but in the smoke, the birds often had movements that took them parallel or even in the opposite direction of Summer Lake. The somewhat favorable conditions this leading bird obtained by transversing around the eastern side of the Cascades rapidly deteriorated to the degree that the bird made exploratory flights up the slopes of Mount Hood near midnight when the last remaining Thule goose began rafting off of the coast of Washington. Perseverance paid for this leading bird, and despite the extra time it spent flying, it was the first to reach Summer Lake a little over 24 hours after first encountering the smoke. Meanwhile, the birds that had drafted off the coast remained doing so for nearly 2 full days more, even though the densest plumes of smoke had cleared. It wasn't until the afternoon of September 14th that 2 of the birds joined into the same flock and restarted migration, the path of which took them straight to the Beachy Creek fire. Wait while this catches up. So the Beachy Creek fire was right here. This inset graphic shows the concentration of smoke vertically through the atmosphere along the bird's migration path, with the ground elevations in brown. At the start of the 14th, the bird that had been rafting on the ocean off the Washington coast started to transit into the northern Willamette Valley. The bird encountered the Beachy Creek fire right at the edge of the Cascades, flew along the perimeter of the fire, and up and over the smoke plume, actually through the smoke plume, and the pyrocumulus cloud the fire produced, eventually topping out at 4,000 meters, about 12,000 feet. Then the bird descended into Central Oregon, where the birds, there were 2 in this, 2 individuals that took this track, and spent the night at an agricultural area in Central Oregon.
Hey, Corey, I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So do they normally fly that high, or was this an aberrant thing because of the smoke?
This is definitely an aberrant thing. They'll fly a few hundred feet up off the ground, and they will fly maybe maybe even a few thousand feet up off the ground, but we rarely see them more than maybe 1,000 meters, maybe 3,000 feet above the ground. And usually when we see them do that, it's only when they're making the absolute longest flights, and they're trying to kind of adjust based off of where the warmer air is. So we see, for instance, Ross geese that fly towards Baffin Island will raise and lower their elevation based off of the time of day so that they don't interact with air that's too cold. Because even though they're very efficient and have the ability to kind of moderate the temperature of the air that they bring into their lungs, if that air gets too cold, that can start having impacts on how well they can exchange oxygen and how well they'll fly. So we will see birds fly up a little bit, but usually it's not more than maybe a few thousand feet, certainly not 12. As comparison, the highest that any goose has ever been recorded is 20,000 feet, about.
Wow. And my other question was, how many geese in this scenario are we following?
Yeah, so it's not that many, and that was probably our biggest criticism of the paper as we were trying to get it published. There are 5 geese that took this flight. Only 4 made it all the way down to Summer Lake. So one of them started migration up in Alaska, but we didn't get any information about it in the smoke. So it's not that many birds, but a couple different things. There's only about 7,000 of this bird in existence. So even a few individuals is a pretty important representation. Also, each one of these birds is flying in a flock that's several dozens to hundreds of birds. And so we may only have one marked, but the fact that the 2 birds that did this flight actually left Alaska separately, but joined up off of the coast of Washington and flew together, also just kind of shows that this flocking dynamics is really important. There's really not that many flocks of Thule geese that fly in. So it's not that many, but they all kind of did, they all kind of responded in some way.
Right. So, but the not that many had telemetry, but those ones that have telemetry represented several more in a
Exactly.
flock. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So the following morning, these two birds in Central Oregon separated, and one of them circled back towards the Cascades, where it encountered the rapidly developing White River fire, and stopped at an agricultural area just a short distance from the fire perimeter. The other followed the prevailing winds and ended up in Idaho. And as far as anybody on our team knows, it's the first documented occurrence of this subspecies in the state. It's not that far from Summer Lake, but they just never end up there, though lots of Pacific white-fronted geese are there, and it's virtually impossible to tell the difference of the two without a lot of experience or having them in hand. Meanwhile, the last remaining coastal bird resumed migration and transited the Cascades right near where several of the fires were still burning. It flew far into eastern Oregon, around the densest plumes of smoke, to reach Summer Lake. These remaining two birds remained localized in non-traditional stopover areas for several days. A very unusual behavior that we didn't see in previous or subsequent years. Certainly these birds must have been able to find food, but they were in such different habitat than is normal for that time of year. We really aren't sure what they might have been feeding on. It wasn't until rain arrived on the 18th and again on the 24th and 25th that these birds eventually completed their migrations to Summer Lake. So what could all this mean for an individual goose that encountered smoke? It's not really possible for us to assess all of the potential effects, but we could come up with some ballpark estimates from existing literature to look at energy, how much energy is spent and how much energy is gained through foraging. Energetically, the biggest impact would result from the extra flight distance. Flight is the most energetically demanding activity most birds undertake. And on average, the disorganized and kind of recursive flights that we saw extended the migration from Alaska to Summer Lake by over 25%. That's equivalent to, instead of stopping in Summer Lake, heading past Sacramento. Secondarily, the extended rafting on the open ocean was assumed to occur with no means for birds to obtain food, unless they're eating seaweed or something that's floating by. If this is the case, then the amount of time that the birds spent on the ocean was nearly half again as long as the previous year. So this extended the duration of migration at a time where birds couldn't get food. Combined, these effects would produce a caloric deficit of, say, up to 1,000 calories. The range that we observed from our 4 birds was 400 to 1,100, and those were using some pretty conservative estimates. Given the amount of time that white-fronted geese spend eating and how effective they are when they do eat, this energy deficit would require 30 to 40 hours spent actively eating, and would take several days and be a pretty dramatic shift in a normal behavior during that time of year. I'd like to reiterate that there are several other impacts that we couldn't really assess that make our estimates a bit more conservative than they could be. One example is that big overflight over the plume of smoke. To climb that high takes a lot of energy. Level flight is certainly a lot easier than going up and down repeatedly. Also, we don't really know what the impact of poor air quality would be on the ability to oxygenate their muscles and effectively use, oxygen and energy in flight. It's not really clear whether the kind of physiological models of flight that we have could be adapted to look at this sort of impact. But there are some other researchers from Washington and now down in UCLA that are looking at this. And lastly, we're not really sure what the impact of using these alternative sites would be. These birds are often pretty keyed in and require certain timing to replenish food supplies where they stop. Having to go to a novel place, it's like picking your greasy spoon on a road trip. You're never quite sure if it's going to be the best thing ever or require some Pepto-Bismol after. Well, we can't really address.
Corey?
Yeah.
Okay, what do they eat normally?
So the Thule Goose is even more so than regular white-fronted geese. They're really tuber eaters. So they like to eat the roots of marsh plants. They're much more keyed into the wetlands than, say, snow geese or Ross geese that will be more in grain fields, agricultural areas, or eating grass, depending on the time of year. During the fall migration, most of the grass isn't very palatable. It's kind of senescing already, especially in the arid part of the states. So they're really focused in on, cattails, watergrass tubers, and any of the plants that they can reach in the wetlands. And so stopping in a place like the Columbia River, I'm sure there's some stuff there that they could eat, but I'm not quite sure what it would be because it's very different. Definitely the agricultural areas, they have no problem eating grain. They'll eat rice, they'll devour rice when they arrive in the Central Valley in September or early October. But they still will stay focused even then, often in the wetlands. They use rice just because it's so available and it's definitely a high energy food. So it's really those spots that they're hitting. And the nice thing about tubers is they're very starchy. They tend to have a lot of energy. The bad thing about them is it takes an awful long time to digest them. So it's often pretty hard to recharge fast when you're eating that kind of stuff. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. So the consequences of this are pretty clear. This is most likely a juvenile Pacific white-fronted goose, not a Thule goose, but it represents what birds more broadly may experience. This bird was found by a retired waterfowl biologist on a state highway in northern Nevada, at least 50 miles from the nearest wetland in 2020. It weighed approximately half of what a healthy juvenile goose should weigh and is presumed to die of starvation. All of these findings and thinking about all of this stuff really kind of left us wondering whether Thule Goose are a good model for these kinds of effects, or are they kind of a special case? Behaviorally, the Thule Goose does occupy some kind of extremes. Specifically, they tend to migrate early, and they're really tied to limited stopover areas. 95% of the Thule geese are going to stop at Summer Lake, no matter what the conditions they experience trying to get there. And because they're coastal migrants, they don't really have an alternative route. If they move the wrong direction, they're going to Japan. They pretty much have to have one path that they can follow. So they don't really have a whole lot of redundancy in their migration pathway. Plus, as a subspecies, their populations are already low. But on the other side, they're also a large bird that should have plenty of reserves, which may buffer them from some of the detrimental effects of migration, such as delayed or increased flights, and may allow them to exhibit more varied responses than would be available to smaller migrating species. For example, just a few weeks prior to our birds coming down, there was a lot of discussion about passerines, mostly insectivorous birds, dying in the Southern Rockies. And smoke is still considered one factor why that might be. There was also a big cold snap. Those birds were starving and pretty dramatically dying before they could complete migration or get to suitable stopover spots. And I think that's because they're smaller bodied birds. It really takes a lot for a goose to starve. They're full of fat. They really can pack on the pounds when they need to, and they know how to do that. It's more the flycatchers that warblers that I worry about. I think there's always going to be a lot of randomness around these kind of catastrophic natural events, like what we saw with the fire season in 2020. So I anticipate that there's really this type of scenario we saw is only going to happen in the occasional year, but it's also going to happen. And because it happens infrequently, that doesn't necessarily make them any less impactful to the populations. With a growing overlap between fire and migration, coupled with the greater range and scale of wildfires and other pressures on migratory populations like lack of habitat and drought, I would assume that these risks will continue to increase for other species as well. That's the last of my presentation about Thule geese. I'm happy to provide any more discussion. I see a question in the chat. I'm sorry I didn't see it before. I'm not sure when it came, but
it just came in, Corey.
Okay. So the question is asking about how fires have affected sandhill cranes in the Pacific Flyway. And a smaller northern flight this year. So I'm guessing you're referring to this year's spring migration is smaller than you have traditionally seen. I wish that we were still doing work with sandhills. We did a bunch of satellite tracking of them about, I'm gonna guess about 10 years ago now. I think one of the things that we've noticed this year is the spring migration has been really very extended. We had a snow goose in Boise in February, which just baffles me. That's 2 months earlier than we would normally see them that far north. And so what I think might have been happening, and it wasn't just snow geese, we've seen that with other species as well. Birds that aren't calendar migrants, so like what we've seen with Ross's geese is that they're calendar migrants. They're going to be at the same spots on the same days year after year. Most of the other birds are actually pretty close to calendar migrants too, but snow geese in particular will push that envelope, and they're always trying to be the first ones north. Sandhills, I don't think are that way. They're probably more like calendar migrants, but and I say that only because I feel like they depart a little bit later, more like the white-fronted geese do. But they also probably had a more extended range, so smaller flights spread over a longer time period might be responsible. I don't think we've seen a reduction in population down here, but I would be really interested to talk with the Nature Conservancy folks that do surveys at the main colonies and double check that. Most of the areas qualify that a little bit, where the sandhill colonies are, still had plenty of water this year. So I don't think drought would have affected anything. I also don't think the fires would have affected sandhills. because the timing of their migration just didn't match the timing of the wildfires.
So feel free, anyone, to you can unmute yourself and ask questions. Barbie, if you had any specific question about that other than what you put in the chat. I had a question earlier, but now I forgot what it was. I should have asked at the time, huh?
Starting to sound like me if I don't write it down.
And the link that you put in the chat, can you put that up again in case people came in late? They wouldn't be able to see that probably.
Sure.
But that's the one that you sent me earlier, and it's fixed now so that it's visual. Anybody can see it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it has, we have collaborators that work at our office that really focus on like the breeding ecology. We've been doing nesting work in the Suisun Marsh for over 25 years, I think now. And so we have a pretty long history of tracking population changes down there, which we're hoping to expand. Suisun Marsh is a really phenomenal place and an amazing resource in the Pacific Flyway for waterfowl. It's also kind of like this tiny little knot off of the side of the delta, and it's very different than anything else in the state. It's this brackish water system with a lot of private land that's only managed for ducks. And so it's great for duck species and hunters if you're of that bent, but it doesn't really extrapolate to what ducks in the rice are doing or what ducks in San Joaquin Valley are doing. And so we're really hoping to expand that, because there's a very large population of breeding waterfowl that are important to California. Most of the mallards, probably 3 out of 4 mallards in the state in the winter, are locally bred birds. Same with gadwall, same with cinnamon teal.
Really?
So whereas most flyways, they have this model of, they base most of their hunting regulations based off of mallards, which are tied to how many wetlands in North Dakota, South Dakota, and eastern Montana are flooded in the spring. And that has absolutely no relevance to the number of mallards that we have here.
Yeah, because the mallards here in California pretty much don't migrate.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, or they'll go to, or maybe at most Oregon or Washington. We have the very first, actually, we marked 4 mallards at the very first, effort of trying our new transmitters, and one of those 4 migrated to Alberta, and I think it's the last. It was one of the first 4 birds we marked. 1,300 birds later, it's still the only one that's migrated to Alberta. And other species also that are like cinnamon teal. We had a cinnamon teal that was caught actually on a nest in Suisun. Her nest failed. It was eaten by a skunk or raccoon or something. And she migrated to Montana like the 3rd week of May. And that's still the middle of nesting season in Montana. And so we had a bird that could have nested in 2 flyways the same year.
Wow.
Which is something that's just not on anybody's radar. I don't think it's a common thing, but really goes to show that, the timing and what happens to these birds. Flyways are an important concept, but they're a little more fluid, I think, than we like to talk about them.
Yeah, the other question I remember now that I was going to ask was about Thule geese identification, because once I contacted you, I looked on eBird to find out that their I guess is fairly frequently Thule geese found in like Sacramento National and probably Calusa, and both Calusa and Sacramento National Wildlife Refuges. So, and you mentioned at the beginning of your talk how difficult it is to discern one from the other, because I've been in the blinds there, and once I found out that there was another subspecies of greater white-fronted geese, I specifically looked for Thule geese, and I have no idea what I was looking for.
Yeah, it's funny. Everybody you talk to has a different metric, and they all work for them and not for anybody else. So the technical way that we do it is through mandible measurements. So there's like a different ratio of how long versus how wide. But if you weigh them, they will on average as a group will be quite a bit heavier than Pacifics. Their color, if you look at it under like a spectrometer, they're a little bit different. So I know folks that I really trust that will, pull the Thule geese out of a flock. They'll pull the 4 or 5 that are Thule geese out. Really, it seems to be mostly behavioral. There's a lot of people that really poo-poo this kind of special hunting zone, which is basically west of the Sacramento River in Calusa County and Glenn County, this little box. And they're like, there's no way that these birds know where that box is. So this whole hunting management thing is bogus. It's surprising to me, 7 years on, at how much those Thule geese, but not the Pacifics, stay inside that box. With the exception that the Thule geese will go down to Suisun Marsh, and the Pacifics never go down to Suisun Marsh. Neither do snow geese or Ross geese. So this little carve out west of the river, right around where Calusa, Delavan, and Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge are, was built to that carve out for the dark goose harvest management was done to protect the Thule geese, and it's really amazing to me at how that affects Thule geese. That's really where they spend the majority of their time. The thing that's really scary this year is that's also where Calusa County is one of the heaviest rice growing, Calusa and Butte, but for the west side of the county, that's where all the rice is grown, and that's where those birds are going in and feeding. That's probably the number one management problem that we have early in the year is Thule geese coming down and eating all the rice before the farmers can harvest it. And because they're a species of concern, there's really nothing that the farmers can do. Like they can't go out and shoot them through depredation permits or something like that. They can't even really harass them to try and get them out. And so there's always this kind of interplay between the refuge trying to provide enough habitat on the refuge early that only really benefits the Thule geese versus saving their water, saving their resources later when it can benefit a wider variety of birds. And sometimes they have to put that water out early, just because if they don't, the geese are going to eat up all the rice fields and cause bigger problems for more people. But this year with the droughts, they're anticipating a 90% reduction of rice in that zone. And we have no idea what that's going to do. We know it's not good, but it's going to be a really different environment this year. It's hard to overstate how important the Pacific Flyway bird population, not just waterfowl, but birds in general, all the shorebirds also really depend on this flooded rice ground. And rice farmers, they're not doing it for the birds.
No,
it's a huge benefit that the birds have, but if they're going to make a lot more money sending that water somewhere else.
are Thule geese legal to harvest?
Yeah, they're part of the, because you can't
Discern what
expect people, yeah, because you can't expect people to tell the difference. They allow a limited harvest for part of what would normally be allowed. And then in that closed zone where the Thule geese hang out, they shut that down early. And they can actually programmatically, if they get so many, if they get a certain number of Thule geese that come through the check stations at the refuges, they'll actually even shut it down earlier. It's kind of like what they've done with you know, Dungeness crab or something. Like if too many whales get caught in nets, they'll suspend the season. It's the same kind of thing. It's the population can withstand a little bit of hunting pressure. They're still a goose, right? They still lay a lot of eggs. Their primary issue is that their main breeding colony in the 60s and 70s got pretty much totally destroyed when a volcano erupted in Alaska. And so the population has been trying to find better nesting habitat in Alaska, and it's taken several years, and they're still in kind of suboptimal areas. And so they just don't reproduce quite as well as, say, the Pacific or mid-continent white fronts.
So it sounds like I need to speak to some of the birders who have posted eBird sightings of Thule geese down there in the valley to ask them how they identified those birds.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the state biologist actually oftentimes defers to her subordinate when they're out in the field together. She does just as good a job as he does, but this guy is just, he's got laser focus on them, and he's probably one of maybe 3 people that I would trust their field ID. I mean, once you see them side by side, like I said, behaviorally, even in the same pond, Thule geese will almost always be sitting in a family group. You'll almost never see 1 or 2 Thule geese off on their own. It's almost always 5 or 6 of them sitting together, mom and pop and all the young ones. In fact, it's one of the bigger issues that we have when we catch them. We don't put all of our tags out. We catch 5 birds. We may only put 1 or 2 tags out, because chances are we've caught one big family group, and we're just going to be having 5 tags that go around together, around back and forth. And that actually happens year before last. We put 3 birds on, and we put them on. We'll usually pick either males or females from one capture, so that we can also kind of not get a mated pair and end up tracking those 2 together. So we marked 3 males, and it turned out they were all brothers, and they've been hanging out together for 2.5 years. And we just like 3 days ago, some folks in Alaska took a photo of one of them with the collar on his neck, and we're like, oh, the brothers made it back up north. So
That's great. Does anybody have any other questions?
I do. I have a question. So I'm trying to count the number of birds you started out tracking. It was 5, and then one of them went up and over the smoke, and 2 rafted and waited to get through. What happened to the other 2?
So yes, we actually ended up having 3 total that rafted. Actually, three of them rafted. 1 flew around, and then one of them started a migration but never made it down with a working transmitter further down.
Oh.
So we have 4 that made that path through the smoke, and all of them rafted. And that's another thing that we didn't know. I mean, Thule geese are not, they're not emperor geese. They're not a sea goose. But almost every Thule goose and about half of the Pacific white-fronted geese stop on the ocean, but they'll stop for 8 hours overnight, and then get up and fly. Definitely not for multiple days. I think the longest raft that we had, that last one that stayed down there, was on the water for over 4 days. And I mean, I'm not sure what that much salt water for that long would do to a goose foot, but I can't imagine it was comfortable. The only time we've seen anything like that was actually a snow goose that was migrating back from Wrangel Island and flew past Kodiak Islands and hit a gale. It was blowing 60-mile-an-hour winds for 2 days and had 18-foot seas. And this bird sat on the water in 18-foot seas for 2 days and then got up and flew to Ketchikan. That's probably the most extreme conditions I think we've seen them encounter. Oh, I think you're muted, Larry.
How's that?
There you go.
So I don't have any more questions. Does anybody else have any more questions for Corey or any concerns
I-
about anything?
I had a question. If you come across somebody who is doing sandhill crane research, let us know.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think we'd all be, they're such iconic birds.
Yeah. Yeah, I really wish. So the person that we worked with, I know folks that do it in the mid-continent and in Utah, but
Yeah,
but not here. The person that we worked with is Gary Ivey. He's really well known in the crane world, and he did his degree at Oregon State on the project that we assisted with, and that work has been kind of lost to time as far as I've been able to tell. Gary is so busy, he's doing 20 other things elsewhere, and I think he's semi-retired already at this stage. So I really wish we were doing more work with them. They're very fun birds to work with.
How do you spell?
I'm surprised. Do they land at Summer Lake?
Oh, I'm sure they do. Yeah, I'm sure they do. Yeah. I'm trying to think where. I think we had. I'm going to be totally guessing, so I don't want to say. I don't want to predict too much, but I mean, Summer Lake and Klamath and Malheur are probably the three most important traditional areas for all water birds, not just cranes and waterfowl, but all the shorebirds as well. And recently, Goose Lake. Goose Lake used to be too deep, and then it became too dry, and then it became perfect. And Goose Lake is one of these really bizarre kind of. It's going to disappear before anybody realizes it. And right now it's at the absolute perfect conditions for shorebirds and waterbirds. But another 2 or 3 drought years like this, and it's going to disappear again.
It'll be gone.
Yeah.
The other thing I was fascinated by is the impact of the volcano. What year, roughly?
Let me look real quick. I'll try to remember. I know it's so the volcano is called the Mount Redoubt, and it's in that house out. It's in the Prince William Sound area, I think. it erupts often. It's not like that was the last big eruption, but like it erupted in 2009. But it wasn't the big one. I think the big one was 19, it looks like 1990.
Okay,
And that one was like 6 months it erupted. And that's what really kind of affected a lot of the breeding areas. So now the birds have kind of moved north, up towards Anchorage, and Scylla Susitna Flats is kind of the generic name for it. And it's a totally fine, great spot to nest. But I think they're more exposed there to things like grizzly bears and ravens, because the ravens get attracted to all the human development that's up there. So Mount Redoubt doesn't have any, there's nothing there to attract them. But
okay.
Gary Ivey, you mentioned, how do you spell his last name? I-V-Y.
IVEY.
And is he with the US Geological Survey, or is he?
No,
he's probably retired by now.
yeah, he worked for, I forget what the exact name of it is. It's like the International Crane Foundation or something. I think they're based in Wisconsin or Nebraska or somewhere back east, Midwest. And he did a lot of his work in Alaska. I know we had he marked a lot of birds up around Nome and Homer. And that's where a lot of the birds that we marked down here would end up going back to.
Cool.
Well, Corey, this has been terrific. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right,
Great-
thanks,
Great to
everyone.
be part of your group.
Yeah,
Yes.
thanks
Yeah,
a lot. It was
great.
a really good presentation.